Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast and the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. Dr. Charles Weaver joins us again to talk about the history of solfège and the usefulness of thinking about the original hexachord, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. If you're interested in this topic, you might consider applying to take his advanced seminar in Gregorian chant this summer at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music's summer graduate program. Offered in the afternoons of July 21st through the 25th, the course will offer a detailed look at the pitch organization of Gregorian melodies, beginning with Guido of Arezzo's 11th century innovations of staff notation and solfège. In the centuries after Guido, his six-note solfège system developed into a robust theoretical pitch space that was a staple of musical pedagogy until at least the 18th century. Students will become confident users of both hexachords and the Guidonian hand, and will study their application to Gregorian chant and other diatonic music. The class will also survey the theory of modes in Gregorian chant, examining both the historical establishment of the 8-mode system in the first millennium, as well as the more recent archaic mode theory of Dom Jean Clair, considering especially how that theory dovetails with Guido's own observations about the scale. Applications are now open, and an extensive brochure outlines more details on our website. To find out more about this or our 8 other classes, please visit catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org and click on Summer Courses. And now, on to the interview. Charlie, I think you're the most frequent flyerist of the frequent flyers, and so welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back, Jenny. It's always nice to be here.
We're going to talk a little bit about the history of solfège. And so, obviously the first question is, what is solfège and why do we sometimes hear that referred to as solfège, solfeggio, and should we refer to it in Italian rather than French? Is related to the question of where it came from in the first place.
Sure. And in the older ways of talking about it, people also use the term solmization. But all of those terms, solfeggio, solfeggiare, solfège, solmization, they all come from the syllables themselves. What they are is a mnemonic device that apply certain essentially nonsense syllables to the notes within the musical scale. In the earliest conceptions of this was always diatonic music. So you're dealing with the scale on which Gregorian chant is based. The solfège is an invention of the monk Guido of Arezzo, one of the many Benedictines to contribute to music history over the long and glorious history of that order. And the idea is that Guido's system makes the ability to learn how to sing chant much more efficient. He's dealing with a mainly oral tradition of chant learning, where students learn essentially by rote how to sing all the chants of the church's year for both the Mass and the office. And the solmization that Guido comes up with is a really ingenious way to map the kinds of melodies that happen in chant onto an understandable intervallic grid. So if you understand that ut to re is always a whole step, re to mi is always a whole step, mi to fa is always a half step, by applying these syllables to the notes of a chant, and I'll get into where those syllables in particular come from in just a second. By applying those to a chant, you can use your memory of how those intervals sound to read a new chant with much less intensive training than you would if you were approaching it as though you'd never heard any aspect of it before. So it's a clever way to apply systematic thinking to something that otherwise is extremely unmanageable in other words, a huge repertoire of melody.
Great. Can I ask you, so you say nonsense syllables, but really there is kind of like a logic behind which a vowel is used, for example, on which scale degree. And I think, the question that a lot of people have when they're coming into solfège is that what is that logic? Because it does feel like nonsense, and it can feel overwhelming when you're first learning solfège. I remember not too long ago, I was watching a sort of introductory video into a solfeggio system for Eastern chant, and it was totally different from ours. And I felt like, oh wow, it is really hard at the beginning to remember which name goes where.
Right, and in the West as well, there have been multiple different systems. During the Protestant Reformation, some people tried to make Bossetization a system that would replace solfège because
it was too Catholic.
Yeah, exactly. It's based on a completely different set of syllables. The English writer Roger North in the 18th century decided to come up with a series of syllables that would actually begin with the letters of the scale that they're on. So in other words, C should be sa, D should be do, E should be F should be fa, G should be go, A should be r, and so on and so forth. So there have been many different systems. Guido's system uses the text of a hymn to St. John the Baptist, the text of which is ut queant laxis resonare fibris mira gestorum famuli tuorum solve polluti labi reatum sancte Ioannis. And the first syllable of each of those little phrases is what he uses for the 6 notes of the scale. And he presumably wrote the melody that goes with it. So it's not doesn't seem to be one of the melodies that is traditionally associated with that text, but he designed it in such a way that you can sing this text to that melody, and each phrase of the chant starts on a different note of the scale. So you have ut queant laxis resonare fibris mira gestorum famuli tuorum solve polluti labi reatum, and you've gone up from ut through re, mi, fa, sol to la, and then the final phrase doesn't get a syllable. Sancte Ioannis. It just brings the tune to a close with a cadence. But in 7-note systems, the initials SJ for Sancte Ioannis are treated as the syllable C, which gets added to the scale. In the Anglophone world, C often becomes T, so you can have your tea with jam and bread, as the song goes. But the original system only had 6 notes, which actually is an important and often misunderstood feature of that system, which I hope we'll get into today.
Yes, well, that's the next question. So why is it only 6 notes? And that's obviously the 6 hex being hexachordal.
Yeah, so nowadays we refer to the 6-note scale as a hexachord. That's essentially kind of modern terminology. Guido didn't say these are the hexachords. He just called it the scale. Ut, re, mi, fa, sol, and la.
What is his Latin word for it?
For the scale itself?
Yes.
Just scala or something
okay.
like that. Yeah, exactly. There's a certain ease and symmetry to the 6-note scale that you give up a little bit if you go into other systems. For instance, ut, re, mi is 2 whole steps, fa, sol, la is 2 whole steps, and they are sort of situated symmetrically around the central mi, fa, which is a semitone. And if you are singing chant, knowing where the semitones are is actually more than half of the battle to singing properly where the chant is. Guido's other big invention, of course, is the staff, for a staff notation, where you draw lines on a page and you can notate a chant by taking your neumes, which otherwise don't necessarily show specific pitch information, and situating them on this grid so that every note that is the same pitch as previous instances of that pitch in a chant are placed on the same vertical level as helped by the line of the staff. And if you think about the staff, the important bits, the bits that Guido chose to color especially, are the places where there are semitones, because those are really points of orientation around which you gravitate when you sing. So in Guido's original staff, both F and C are drawn in different colors. And this shows where the semitones are in the scale. And those are kind of the key points to bear in mind to orient yourself around. This also very elegantly dovetails with the actual music of Gregorian chant, which in every mode seems to have kind of structural development around those points. So even in the first mode, where D and A are the kind of tonal structures, F and C are both important points of recitation, as shown by where the melodies tend to fall in structural terms. In the later system, we don't use colored lines anymore on the staff, but we still put our clefs on those lines. And if you think about what clef means in French, it means key. That's still the key to the staff. It's still the point to know where to situate yourself around. So the C clef, nowadays, because we often apply the 7-note solfège system to chant, we talk about a do clef and a fa clef, but really all clefs are fa clefs if you think about it. And that's why you can sometimes, in early chant pedagogy, draw both clefs, draw where the F clef and the C clef are, because those are the places where the half steps fall. And so the nice thing about the 6-note system is that you are only concerned with the nearest semitone. Many chants only have a range of 6 notes. The Utque ant Laxis chant that Guido wrote himself only has those 6 notes of the scale. There are plenty other chants, especially chants for the office antiphons, where the entire range of the chant just falls within one scale of 6 notes with only one semitone that you have to be worried about. So from that point of view, much simpler to use the 6-note system. It does have the drawback, or you might say the bonus feature, that if you do have a wider range where you have 2 semitones you have to work around, you do have to switch between scales, which technically is what we call mutation, just means changing from one scale to another.
And so, one of the most interesting things when you look at what Guido did is that not only does it work theoretically, but it's really the fruit of true pedagogy. Because if we think about where do choirs usually go out of tune, it's maybe perhaps they're running out of breath, or that they didn't allot enough breath to end in tune, and their penultimate sounds and ultimate sounds are flat. But oftentimes it's on the half steps.
Yeah, it's really, you really have to be centered around the half steps when you're singing, especially if you're singing in a kind of medieval setting where you are relying only on the human voice. The insistence on an octave-based scale, if you think about it, really betrays our kind of instrumental or perhaps even keyboard sensibilities about how musical pitch works. If you are a singer, I have a pretty typical male voice, not quite a bass, not quite a tenor, just kind of mid. And in my voice, the bass C and the C an octave above, middle C, they feel very different. They're the lower C requires much less energy to sing. And the C an octave below that is extremely low, and I can only hit it, sometimes early in the morning before I've warmed up. And middle C is, kind of a high note. I've got to, if I'm going to have to sing middle C, I got to gird my loins a little bit. So, it's only because I'm also used to sitting at a keyboard and looking at the pattern of the keys that I would say that those Cs are all equivalent. And they are, they're related to each other. But if I'm approaching it entirely from a singer's point of view, there's no reason that low do and high do should necessarily have the same syllable, because they're in such different parts of my voice. If I encounter them in a chant, they don't seem to have such an obvious identity relationship with each other.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about this evolution out of the hexachord. When do we start adding a seventh note and then thinking about the octave?
Yeah. So the six-note system, as I said, it originated with Guido in the 11th century. So kind of early in that century. Let's just round it down to the year 1000. In the 17th century, different writers on music started to come up with different ways to add a seventh syllable. And these would sort of complete the octave scale so that every do could just be C, every la could be A, and you wouldn't have to worry about moving back and forth between them.
Well, and can I insert something there, that the idea of the octave is what you're saying. Yes, it really comes from instrumental practice, but it also, to be fair, comes from the 2-to-1 ratio, which was also in mind.
Yep.
And so how did that work into kind of predominating the thought about the scale?
Right. Well, I mean, in the old six-note way of thinking about it, middle C can be do, and the C an octave below that can be do. But if you're singing within a chant, you're much less likely to use both of those syllables, because if you're thinking of middle C as do, you're orienting it around the E, F semitone above. Whereas if you think of that middle C as fa, you're orienting it around the B, C semitone below. So typically, what happens in a chant is you stitch two of these scales together by replacing either sol or la on the way up with the re from the hexachord above. So, for instance, if I'm singing a C major scale, and I would start here on ut, and I would, in the six-note system, I would sing ut, re, mi, fa, sol, re, mi, fa. And there I've switched so that A, which would be la, it becomes A, which is re, so that the B, C semitone can become mi, fa. And if I'm going back down, I'll change what would be A, re into A, la. So I would sing fa, mi, la, sol, fa, mi, re, ut. And so it is true that, if I'm singing together with some kids and we're singing the same melody in octaves, I might sing C ut and they might sing C ut, but only because we're both going to go up from there. Within an actual chant, in the six-note system, singers are completely comfortable naming that octave as ut, fa, because it's filling in all the notes in between. Ut, re, mi, fa, sol, re, mi, fa, and fa, mi, la, sol, fa, mi, re, ut, fa, ut. No problem. Now, from a certain rationalist point of view, that's a little silly because, as you say, it's been recognized since at least the ancient Greeks and probably before that there's a certain special connection between notes an octave apart, namely that they are in this 2-to-1 ratio with regards to string lengths or pipe lengths or frequency ratios and all that sort of stuff. So there were, in the 17th century, these proposals for rationalizing the system, coming up with some name for B that could allow you to only have C ut and get rid of C fa as a category altogether. Adriano Banchieri is an early example of this, writing in the early 17th century. He's one of the people responsible for the Medicean gradual edition of chant, a very kind of famous chant edition.
And a student of Palestrino, no?
Yeah, and he writes a ton of really useful books about all kinds of aspects of singing and playing music. And he teaches the 6-note solfège system, but he also suggests a possible 7th note where you call B natural B and you call B flat ba. So then your scale becomes ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, bi, ut, or something like that. The French, shortly after this, adopt a 7-note system, and it's one that they use to this day. So they still name the notes after the solfège syllables. So if something's in C minor, they say it's in ut mineur, and so on and so forth. And they use the syllable C for B. But the 6-note system stuck around much longer than people often think, and it was geographical in nature where that happened and where it didn't. So the 6-note version was predominant in Italy and Spain well into the 18th century and possibly beyond. The 7-note system was predominant in France. Germany was divided, as it often has been in music history.
Touché.
So there were, fierce pamphlet wars being waged in the 18th century over whether we should have 6-note solfège or 7-note solfège. The main protagonists of this pamphlet war were Johann Mattheson and a theorist named Johann Buttstedt. It appears that J.S. Bach was on the 6-note side. There's a canon by Bach that's based on a kind of ground bass, and the bass line he labels mi fa, and the little inscription above the canon says mi fa et fa mi est tota musica. So all music is about the semitones for Bach, which makes sense. But the ground bass goes like this. Da 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 da, which he labels as fa mi fa mi fa mi fa mi fa. So in other words, he's completely in support of the hexachord idea and all semitones being mi fa. It had remarkable staying power, such that we also have, one really striking late example is a lesson book from the 1790s where that we have belonging to Antonio Salieri, the villain from the Amadeus movie about Mozart, but actually quite an accomplished Italian composer of his time. And we have a lesson book from the 1790s where he's labeled a melody using solfège syllables, and he's using the old 6-note system. So it stuck around for a long time. People like Haydn would have learned solfège this way. And just for that reason alone, I think it's worth people taking a closer look at. You just have to get past the idea that octave equivalence means that one note should have the same syllable in every octave. And once you let that go, you start to realize that the 6-note version actually has some advantages.
Right. So can you tell us a little bit about when ut actually becomes do? And of course, when it becomes do, then it has the same vowel as sol. So it seems to have something to do with a tonic dominant sort of axis of tonal music, no?
It could be that, although the French stuck with ut, maybe just in their way to be contrary to the Italians. But anyway, at some point in the 17th century in Italy, ut changed to do. The usual explanation given is that it's just easier to sing. And I suppose if you're an Italian, maybe that's true. But I think, actually, no, I will go beyond that and say as a choral director, it's probably easier for singers to sing do than ut. Ut feels kind of effortful, and ending on a consonant is not so good. So yeah, at some point in the 1600s, they switched to do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. But as I said, in Italy, they still stuck with the 6-note system, far beyond that.
Right. So now let's talk about going beyond even a 6-note system or an octave system to chromatics. When do we start seeing solfège responding in a real way to chromatics in music?
So it's interesting that the 6-note system is so closely related with the idea of the gamut, or the kind of the pitch space in which music operates. What the gamut is a series of 20 notes or 21 notes, going from the low G, like the G at the bottom of the bass staff, to the E in the top space of the treble staff. It's that range, and it's conceived of as a series of interlocking hexachords. And this is often depicted being kind of placed on the image of a hand, which is a common medieval mnemonic device, where each joint of each of the fingers represents one of these pitches, and on each joint you show the letter name of the pitch and also all the syllables that pitch can be, using the 6-note hexachord system. That way of conceiving of pitch space was still the dominant way throughout the Renaissance, the time of composers like Palestrina and Victoria and Bird and Lassus. And the way chromatics are dealt with is that they are thought of as being not, they're off the grid, as it were. They're not on the hand. And so the notes on the hand are musica vera. They are true notes. And notes that are off the hand are musica ficta. They're made-up notes. In other words, they're notes that have intervallic relationships to the notes around them that aren't the kind of factory model that you get when you are issued a hand at birth or before birth. So they think of inflecting notes, using sharps or flats, as basically taking you off of the hand. Now, when you do that, you have to think about, do you change the solfège system to go to some other hexachord so that your fictitious note is some real note in some other hexachord? Or do you just kind of squint at it and pretend that you didn't hear that semitone and leave it at that? Interestingly enough, historically, the solution that they came up with, it might surprise you, but it's that sharpened notes don't affect the solfège, and flattened notes are always fa. And if you think about why that is, it has to do with how chromatic notes arise in the Renaissance. Typically, in the context of counterpoint, if you have a cadence where one voice is going down from E to D and another voice is going to go up from C to D, it's that arriving on that octave is like a feeling of achieving perfection. And the octave is arrived at through contrary motion. So you have a sixth, E, C, opening out to the octave, and a kind of less perfect interval, the interval of the sixth, which is based on a more complicated ratio than the 2-to-1 that you've already mentioned with the octave. It's sort of, the voices move against each other and arrive at this point of repose, which is perfection. And that is how sort of musical phrases and musical pieces come to a close in the Renaissance. It often, for the sake of beauty, you would want to make the C, which is moving up to D, a C sharp. This is often especially done in conjunction with a suspension. So you'll have the classic 3-part Renaissance cadence of E against D, so a dissonant seventh. The D moves down over the sustained E to C sharp. So you have E, C sharp, a major sixth, an imperfect consonance. And then the voices move out to an octave D, D. So it's a 3-stage thing. What a friend of mine, Sarah Mead, has brilliantly labeled the ouch, ooh, ah model of the Renaissance cadence. You have a dissonant 7th, E, D, the consonant resolution, E, C sharp, that's the ooh, and then it opens out to ah. If you are solfeging the upper part, D is either going to be sol or re. But let's say that you've come up from below and your D is sol. At your cadence, the sharp is just, they treat it like fa sharp. So the soprano singer in that instance is going to sing D, C sharp, D as sol, fa, sol. And the tenor singer singing E, D is just going to sing mi, re. No problem. So there's an example where they treat the sharp as just raising the fa a little bit. It's kind of a lower decoration to sol. However, when you're adding flats in Renaissance music, you're usually doing it to fix a diminished fifth that occurs between the voices. So you'll often, if you have an F in the upper part and a B in the lower part, it is often advisable to change your B natural to B flat. Or in the hexachord way of thinking about it, to change B mi into B fa. And so that works for B and F. Well, what if you have B flat in an upper part and an E below it? Well, by extension, you could change E natural or E mi into E fa or E flat. So in practice, what happens when you're solfeging Renaissance style using 6-note solfège, sharps don't affect what syllable you sing, but flats are always fa. It sounds kind of bonkers, but if you actually give it a try, it does start to make some sense. Especially in terms of the contrapuntal reasons for which flats and sharps arrives in the first place.
Okay, so I'm sure that the average music director is thinking like, gosh, I have enough of a hard time like getting my choir to sing using 7-note solfège based on the octave system. But you're telling me that like I should actually be learning a hexachord. What's it going to do for me? What do I get out of it, Dr. Weaver?
Well, it's one fewer syllable you have to teach your choir, so that's a plus. All right, it has a couple of practical uses. In chant, for instance, one of the simplest Kyrie melodies is Kyrie 18. It uses the notes G, A, B, C, D, and E. If your choir knows solfège, you can just use the hexachord and sing fa, fa, mi, re, ut, re, mi, sol, la, sol, fa, sol, mi, etc. So you don't actually need to bother kind of moving into the higher octave. So with kids, I find you can often adopt like the G hexachord as the basis for your teaching. All right, so that's one practical thing.
And can I just insert a little link there? So of course, when you're going through the first book of the Ward method, you start off with 2 notes, then you go to 3, and then up to 5. So do, re, mi, fa, sol. And then she goes up to la by, I think it's chapter 8 or 9. And so early on, you've already got a complete hexachord. Yep,
that's all you need. Now, if you put mi, fa above it, and you've filled out the octave perfectly. But there is a deeper reason, which gets into something that may seem esoteric, but the more time I spend with it, the more I find it to be meaningful. In the pre-modern era, each of the syllables was considered to have a character. Namely, fa and do, or fa and ut rather, are always soft, gentle, peaceful, and so on and so forth. By contrast, mi and la are considered to be hard and aggressive and energetic and warlike and sort of striving upwards. And re and sol are kind of in between. And so that when you are chanting, you are singing within this scale system. Now, we could think of it in another way, which is that if you are in a part of the scale that has a semitone above it, you're going to sing your note as though you're striving to get up across that semitone. Whereas if you're in a part of the scale that has the semitone below it, like C and F, you're going to sing that note in a more relaxed way, a stable way. And many writers in the Renaissance talk about this as something that you should instill from the very first lesson when you're teaching children to sing, that they should learn the distinction between mi notes and fa notes and learn that character and internalize it. Now, this has so many ramifications that it's hard to even wrap your mind around it. One would be the idea of mode and modal ethos. So this is the idea that each mode has its own kind of character. Of course, each mode also gets a planet and a humor and a sign in the zodiac and all that sort of stuff as well. But one aspect of the modes that people often find mysterious or something to further explore is why the modes have different characters from each other, and whether this is founded on anything. You know, there's the kind of traditional Benedictine arrangement where mode 1 is serious, mode 2 is sad, mode 3 is mystical, mode 4 is harmonical, mode 5 is joyful, mode 6 is devotional, mode 7 is angelic, mode 8 is perfect. I think as a chant choir director, instilling that mood in my singers is worth doing. Not because every chant that's in mode 3 is mystical, or every chant that's in mode 5 is joyful. Septuagesima Sunday was a couple weeks ago, and the introit is in mode 5, the mode of joy, and the text for the day is, I'm surrounded by death. So, you have to temper these sort of characters and moods and so on. But perhaps part of the answer is that the modal ethos is an extension of the inherent ethos of each note within the scale. So that every mi fa becomes this point of almost drama as you're singing through the scale. And this is something that colors every melody that uses that interval. And then if you think about that, well, the difference between something that's Phrygian, where the final cadence of the chant is going to be fa mi, or soft hard, that really changes the character from something like Lydian, where the final cadence is going to be re ut, or like coming to a point of repose and softness. And then maybe that relates to why mode 3 chants are thought to be mystical, or mode 4 chants are thought to be harmonic, or as the oral tradition has it for mode 4, that the piece feels like it doesn't finish because it lingers at this point where the music ends but the gaze continues. So there's this kind of ethos reason why learning the hexachords and learning to orient yourself around the half steps might actually have some bear some fruit within your choir.
It is so fruitful to think about the ethos of a mode, not in a cookie cutter shape, but by contact with sources. It just becomes an old friend in the ear, in the voice, and choirs really do benefit from that.
Yeah, I mean, especially as you're sort of going around the liturgical year over and over with your singers, you recognize patterns, each of which is associated with the modes. The distinction between mode 2 tracts and mode 8 tracts and the way they're put together, really colors your understanding of the liturgical year. All of those things are worth learning about to some extent, I think.
Great. Well, we're looking forward to having you here at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music this summer to teach a course on some of these topics and to really go in depth into hexachordal solfège, help people learn the theory behind it, how to actually do it, and how it also relates to modes. But we're not going to get into modes. That would be, for another time.
It's a whole other can of worms. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks so much, Charlie.
Thanks for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.